What happens when a CEO steps into his own store without his usual suit and tie, and hears an employee confess that they can't even afford to eat? Ethan Walker had built his retail empire from scratch. 10 years ago, he opened a single store with a promise: to create a company where employees were treated fairly and customers felt like part of a family. Today, that modest beginning had grown into a chain of 12 locations spread across 3 states. For years, Ethan had taken immense pride in the company's culture, in the stories he'd heard of happy workers and loyal customers. But lately, something wasn't right. Despite solid revenue numbers, whispers of low morale and soaring turnover began to echo through the upper management reports. Rumors circulated that many employees, despite working full-time, were struggling financially. Ethan's district managers insisted that these were merely complaints blown out of proportion, that every employee was simply making the best of a challenging environment. But Ethan, a man who had once personally loaded boxes and negotiated deals on the shop floor, knew there was more to the story. Rather than relying on sanitized reports, he decided to find out the truth for himself. It wasn't difficult to blend in. Most of his store-level employees had never met the real Ethan Walker. To them, he was just another figure in corporate memos. So Ethan set out to disguise himself completely. He let a little gray show in his hair, trimmed his beard down to an unremarkable stubble, and donned a pair of thick-rimmed glasses that obscured the sharp gaze he was known for. Gone were his tailored suits. Instead, he opted for a worn hoodie, a faded polo, and a pair of simple jeans. With a name tag reading Eric, he stepped into one of his stores, located 2 hours away from corporate headquarters, where he knew he'd be truly anonymous. Walking through the front door, Ethan surveyed the scene. The store looked clean enough from the outside, but something felt off. Employees moved about with the robotic precision of those who had been overworked for too long. At the register, a young cashier forced a smile for each customer. But once the customer left, that smile would vanish, replaced by a look of profound exhaustion. The energy in the store was dampened, a heavy, invisible weight that pressed on every interaction. Ethan made his way toward the counter, pretending to browse the menu on the digital kiosk as if he were a regular customer. A young woman in her mid-20s, wearing a slightly oversized uniform and a name tag that read Jessica, greeted him with a weak smile. "Hey there, welcome. What can I get for you today?" Her voice was polite, but it carried a note of distance, as though she had learned long ago not to get too attached. Ethan glanced up at her, then down at the menu. "I'll take a coffee and a breakfast sandwich, please," he said, keeping his tone casual. As Jessica punched in his order at the register, he listened closely, and that's when he heard it. Under her breath, almost inaudibly, Jessica muttered, "Wish I could afford one of those." The word sent a shock through Ethan. He almost turned to ask her what she meant, but before he could, she had already pivoted to gather his order and move away. Ethan's stomach twisted. He had always prided himself on paying fair wages and building a company culture that valued its employees. But here, behind the forced politeness and the automatic smiles, he was hearing the raw, unfiltered truth. His own worker was saying she couldn't afford to eat. He moved closer, careful not to draw attention. As he watched, Jessica's eyes betrayed a deep exhaustion. Dark circles under eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and worries far beyond the daily grind. He decided to push a little further. "Hey, excuse me," he said quietly, leaning toward her when she was restocking the napkin dispensers. "Are you okay? I couldn't help but hear. Do you mean you can't afford a meal?" For an instant, Jessica's face froze, and her eyes darted around as if she feared being overheard. I'm sorry," she stammered, then quickly gathered her things and returned to work. Ethan's heart pounded. He knew that if she had spoken that word out loud, it wasn't an exaggeration. It was a cry for help. Determined to understand the extent of the problem, Ethan decided to observe the store's operations for the rest of his shift. He found a quiet corner near the cafe area and settled down with his half-finished coffee. As he sipped, he watched the employees closely. Every interaction, every glance, every whispered comment became a clue. He saw how Jessica managed to keep up with orders, her efficiency remarkable despite the evident toll on her energy. He noted that when customers arrived, her smile was forced and transient, an automatic mask to hide her weariness. About 15 minutes into his observation, a commotion caught his attention. Jessica reappeared, wiping down tables and restocking napkin dispensers with a speed that belied the exhaustion in her eyes. Then, a familiar, gruff voice from behind the counter made him pause. "Speed it up. We've got a rush coming." Ethan turned to see a man in his late 40s with a name tag that read, Kyle, the shift manager. His arms were crossed tightly, and his expression was cold, almost predatory, as he glared at Jessica. "Come on, Jessica. We can't afford mistakes. You know how much these ingredients cost." Kyle snapped under his breath, his tone low enough that only a few nearby employees could hear. Jessica's face paled further, and she mumbled a quiet, "I'm sorry," before hastily returning to the register. Ethan's blood ran cold. This was no isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. Here was a store that, by all outward appearances, should have been a model of efficiency and care. Yet beneath that facade, employees were being pushed to the brink and even punished for minor mistakes. As the day wore on, Ethan continued to work, all the while taking mental notes and discreetly recording key interactions. He listened to snippets of conversation from the break room. One cashier, speaking softly to a colleague, said, "I've had my paycheck shorted for the third time this month. It's like they're running us into the ground." Another worker added, "I work full-time, and I'm still not sure I'll have enough for dinner tonight." The murmurs were low, almost conspiratorial, and they painted a picture of widespread financial struggle that Ethan had never intended for his company. Determined to gather undeniable evidence, Ethan stayed late after his shift ended. Most employees had already left, but a few lingered in the back, huddled around a table in the staff lounge. He pretended to check his schedule but listened intently instead. In that quiet moment, he heard one employee say softly, "I can't even afford the bus fare sometimes." The despair in that voice was unmistakable. Unable to contain his anger any longer, Ethan's mind raced with the realization that his company, built on the promise of fair wages and dignity, had been slowly corrupted by management practices that prioritized profits over people. That night, he barely slept, his thoughts consumed by the faces of his employees and the harsh truths he'd witnessed. The very next morning, Ethan arrived at the store in his usual corporate attire. Gone were the worn-out hoodie and jeans. He walked in with the commanding presence of the CEO he was, his tailored blazer crisp and his tie perfectly knotted. As he stepped into the store, a hush seemed to fall over the front area. Employees glanced up in shock, some with fear, others with cautious hope. The transformation was palpable. For the first time in a long while, the people working there saw their true leader among them. Ethan made his way straight to the front counter where Kyle, the shift manager, was overseeing the operations. Kyle's face, usually set in a permanent scowl, paled as he saw Ethan approaching. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his voice faltering. Ethan's tone was calm but laced with steel. "Kyle, I'd like an explanation. Earlier today, I heard you tell Jessica, one of our employees, that mistakes would come out of her paycheck. Is it true that you're docking wages for minor errors?" Before Kyle could respond, Jessica, who had been busy with another task, stepped forward. Her eyes, red-rimmed and tired, met Ethan's. "Yes, sir," she said softly. "I've had my pay cut several times. I'm barely able to cover my rent, let alone buy a meal." The room fell silent as Ethan's words sank in. His stomach churned at the confession, and anger surged through him. "This is unacceptable," he said firmly. "I built this company on the principle that every employee deserves a fair wage and respect. Clearly, That promise has been broken. Kyle stuttered, trying to muster a defense. Sir, he began, but Ethan raised a hand to silence him. No more excuses. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties. I expect you to gather your personal belongings and leave this store today. A murmur ran through the employees. Some faces showed relief, others apprehension. Nobody had dared speak out before, and now the person who had been inflicting the most harm was being held accountable. Ethan didn't stop there. He turned to address the entire staff, his voice resonating across the front of the store. I know many of you have been struggling. I've heard your complaints, and I have seen the toll this has taken on you. I want you to know that I take this very seriously. Starting today, we are implementing a complete review of our payroll practices. If you've been shorted, you will be reimbursed immediately. We will be increasing wages where necessary so that no one working full-time here is left wondering if they'll have enough to eat. Jessica's eyes widened, and Lewis, one of the more seasoned employees, nodded slowly in agreement. I've been here for years, and I never thought it would come to this, he said softly. I always believed our wages were fair. Ethan's gaze softened slightly as he continued. I understand that you all have worked hard for this company, and it is my responsibility to ensure you are treated with the respect and dignity you deserve. Effective immediately, any employee who has experienced wage deductions or unfair scheduling will be granted a full audit of their paychecks, and we will make the necessary corrections. The employees exchanged glances, some with cautious optimism, others with disbelief. For many, this was the first time they had seen their employer stand up for them. Over the next several days, Ethan spent time on the floor, working side by side with his staff. He listened intently as they recounted the many injustices they had endured. Unexplained pay cuts, erratic scheduling that left them scrambling for childcare, and a general culture of fear that kept them from speaking up. In one particularly poignant conversation during a quiet afternoon break, Lewis confided, I've been here 6 years. Every time I make a mistake, even a small one, they take money from my paycheck. I barely have enough left to pay my rent, let alone put food on the table. Hearing this, Ethan's resolve hardened. That ends now, he declared firmly. We are going to overhaul our entire system. I want every single one of you to feel secure, respected, and valued. I will personally ensure that you get every dollar you are owed, and then some. As part of his sweeping changes, Ethan introduced a new policy. Every store in the chain would now have a dedicated employee advocate, a person whose sole job would be to listen to workers' concerns and report back directly to the corporate office. At his store, he appointed Lisa, who had quietly managed the floor for far too long, to serve in this role on an interim basis. I trust you, he told her. I know you have the strength and the insight to help make this store a better place for everyone. Lisa's eyes filled with tears of relief as she accepted the responsibility. Thank you, Mr. Walker, she said softly. I promise I won't let you down. In addition to revising payroll practices and establishing a worker advocate, Ethan overhauled the scheduling system. Gone were the days of last-minute changes that left employees scrambling to arrange transportation or miss family obligations. Instead, he introduced a transparent, computer-based scheduling program that allowed every employee to view their shifts well in advance and request changes without fear of retribution. Ethan also mandated that every store hold monthly town hall meetings where employees could share their experiences and suggest improvements. In these meetings, he made it clear that feedback was not only welcome, it was essential for the company's success. I built this company on the belief that our success is measured not just in sales numbers, but in the well-being of our people, he told a room full of cautious faces one afternoon. Your voices matter. I am here to listen, and together we will create a workplace that reflects the values we all deserve. At first, many employees were skeptical. They had heard empty promises before, and the scars of past mistreatment ran deep. But as the weeks turned into months, a noticeable shift took place. The atmosphere in the store began to change. The once dreary break room, filled with whispered complaints, now buzzed with a cautious optimism. Employees started to speak more freely during meetings, and many even began to propose creative ideas for improvement. One day, during a particularly productive town hall meeting, an employee named Marcus stood up and said, "I've been working here for nearly 5 years. I used to think that complaining would only make things worse. But now I feel like we're finally being heard. I believe we can build something great together." The room erupted into quiet applause, a sound of hope after years of silence. Ethan made it a point to personally follow up on every concern raised. He held one-on-one sessions with employees, sometimes over a simple cup of coffee in the morning, and other times during a quiet moment after the store had closed. One afternoon, as he sat with Jessica in a small conference room, she hesitated before speaking. I was always afraid to speak up because I thought I'd lose my job," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan reached out, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "Jessica, you are an essential part of this company. I'm here to make sure that never happens again. I want you to know that your well-being is my top priority, and I will do everything in my power to ensure you're treated fairly." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she managed a small, grateful smile. In the coming weeks, the tangible changes began to restore a sense of dignity and pride among the staff. Employee morale improved noticeably. Sales data, which had been stagnant for too long, began to show signs of recovery as well. Customers, noticing the renewed warmth and genuine service in the stores, started to return. Complaints about long lines and rude service dwindled, replaced by remarks about the friendly smiles and helpful attitudes of the employees. One particularly memorable day, as the store's front doors opened to a bustling morning crowd, Ethan watched from the back as Jessica greeted an elderly gentleman with a sincere smile. "Good morning, sir. Please take your time. There's no rush," she said, her voice gentle and full of warmth. The customer's face softened with gratitude, and Ethan felt a surge of emotion. This was what he had envisioned all those years ago, a place where every person, whether employee or customer, felt valued and cared for. That evening, as the store closed and the lights dimmed, Ethan gathered his team for one final meeting in the employee lounge. The room, which had once echoed with the despair of overworked and underpaid employees, was now filled with a subdued optimism. "I know it hasn't been easy," he began, his voice carrying both authority and empathy. "But I want you all to know that this is just the beginning. We are rebuilding this company from the ground up, not just in terms of processes, but in spirit. From now on, every one of you will be treated with the respect you deserve. If any of you have been unfairly shorted or if your schedules have left you struggling, you will have your voice heard and your concerns addressed immediately." A silence fell over the room. Then slowly, one by one, employees began to speak. Lewis, a veteran worker with a quiet dignity, said, "I've been here for years, and I never thought things would change. But today, I feel like someone is finally listening." Marcus added, "I'm excited to be a part of this new chapter. Feels like we're all in this together." The applause that followed was soft but genuine, a sign that trust was slowly being rebuilt. Ethan concluded the meeting by promising regular check-ins and a continued commitment to transparency. "We're going to institute a policy where every executive in our company spends 1 week a year working in a store or warehouse," he declared. "This isn't just about accountability. It's about staying connected to the people who make our company run. I want every leader to experience firsthand what you go through every day, so we can ensure that no one is left behind." Local media soon caught wind of the dramatic turnaround at Ethan's stores. Headlines emerged such as, "CEO goes undercover, rebuilds company on respect," and "From desperation to dignity, the transformation of a retail empire." Customers and employees alike began sharing their stories of change. Stories of managers who listened, of paychecks that finally added up, and of a company culture that valued every individual. One day, As Ethan was making his weekly unannounced visit to the store, he encountered a scene that filled him with pride. Jessica was at the register, but this time her smile was genuine and unforced. Nearby, Lewis was leading a small group of new employees through the training program that had been overhauled to include not just job duties, but the core values of the company. Even Kyle, now replaced by a new, compassionate supervisor, was seen assisting a customer with patient care. The energy in the store was palpable, and Ethan knew that the hard work was paying off. That evening, as he drove home under the glow of streetlights, Ethan reflected on the journey. He recalled the day he had walked into the store undercover, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth he had uncovered. The image of Jessica, tired and whispering about not being able to afford a meal. The callous words of a manager who treated his staff as expendable. The silent suffering of workers who had given everything yet barely scraped by. It was a reality he could no longer ignore. And now, through decisive action and heartfelt commitment, he had begun to rebuild not just a company, but a community. Ethan's story was a reminder that success isn't measured solely in revenue or market share. It's measured in the well-being of those who contribute to that success every single day. He vowed that he would never again allow the distance between the boardroom and the shop floor to blind him to the struggles of his employees. From that day forward, he would remain present, always listening, and always ready to fight for what was right. As the months turned into a year, the transformation of Ethan's company became a beacon of hope in the business world. The policy changes, the increased wages, the revamped training programs, and the open channels of communication created an environment where employees felt empowered. The annual Under One Roof Day, where every executive spent a day working in a store or warehouse, became a cherished tradition, symbolizing the company's commitment to transparency and accountability. At one of these events, Ethan stood alongside his district managers and frontline workers, watching as a group of new hires practiced customer service techniques on the polished floors of the store. An employee, barely more than a teenager, approached Ethan hesitantly and said, "Mr. Walker, I used to think we were just numbers on a spreadsheet, but now I feel like I matter. Thank you for listening." Ethan's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and he placed a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. "You matter more than you know," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. In board meetings, the focus shifted from abstract metrics to real stories from the store floor. Executives discussed how improved employee morale had led to better customer satisfaction and even boosted sales. The once strained relationship between upper management and store employees had evolved into a partnership built on mutual respect. And as the story of Ethan's radical change spread throughout the community, other businesses began to take note, many inspired by his example to re-examine their own practices and put people before profits. Ethan's transformation wasn't without its challenges. There were days when the old habits threatened to resurface, when a stubborn regional manager would argue that the new policies were too soft or that they would hurt the bottom line. In those moments, Ethan would remind them that a company built on respect and dignity was one that would endure and thrive in the long run. "We're not just in the business of selling products," he would say. "We're in the business of building a community where every individual is valued and every honest deal matters." His words, firm and resolute, resonated with many, slowly eroding the resistance of those clinging to outdated methods. One particularly poignant memory remained etched in Ethan's mind. The face of Jessica as she timidly admitted that she couldn't afford a proper meal on a day when she was supposed to be serving customers. It was that moment, raw and unfiltered, that had galvanized him into action. He recalled sitting there, half-finished coffee in hand, his heart pounding with the realization that his company's promise of fairness had been nothing more than empty words. That day had changed everything, compelling him to step out of the corporate shadows and become the leader his employees so desperately needed. And so, as the sun set on yet another transformed store, Ethan Walker drove home with a deep sense of fulfillment. He knew that the work was far from over, that rebuilding trust and transforming a culture would be a continuous journey. But he also knew that every step taken toward treating his employees with genuine respect was a step in the right direction, a step that would pave the way for a brighter, more humane future for his company. Thank you for watching this story unfold. If you found this narrative as eye-opening and transformative as it is inspiring, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales of courage, accountability, and the power of true leadership. Turn on the notification bell to join us as we continue to explore how one honest action can rebuild even the most broken systems, one genuine, respectful interaction at a time.